Good day, class. Welcome to our final unit. Today we will be looking at an introduction to environmental solutions. So when we talk about environmental solutions, we are talking about solutions that are designed to solve specific environmental problems. So it is important for us to note that there is no one perfect generic solution that can be applied to every environmental problem. Now, there are frameworks and guidelines that can help in the development of environmental solutions. However, those guidelines must be designed specific to the particular case that we're looking at. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So solutions need acceptance by the general public and all parties involved, as well as approvals, usually at the government level, central government level, before the solutions can be implemented. Approvals may be determined by laws that your country has in place, the regulatory requirements or the guidelines that would be designed as part of those laws. And also approvals will also be dependent on the budgets, because many environmental solutions will have a dollar cost associated with it. So do you have the budgets in order to implement those solutions? So one of the areas with regards to environmental solutions we want to look at is government administration. Remember, we did say in the previous slide that many environmental solutions and implementation would often be centered at the highest levels of government, or in other words, central government. So for Trinidad and Tobago, our central government would be at the levels of the prime minister and the cabinet, etc. Local government, that's more at your regional corporation level. So at the central government level, or highest levels of government, they are often responsible for conservation of our resources. We find that EMA, the Environmental Management Authority, would be heavily involved in that. Prevention of pollution in our environment, EMA also involved there. And also sustainable development, which would involve several agencies such as EMA, Town and Country Planning Division, and also, as we will see in the following slides, the Planning and Development Ministry. So at the government level, we have the various ministries, and several of them may be responsible for varying aspects of our environmental protection. So we're going to look at a few of them. We have the Town and Country Planning, Town and Country Planning Division, that is responsible for development, planning, and control. So all forms of development, whatever it may be, whether it's to change the landscape or make improvements to a particular structure, build and construct a new structure, etc. All right. So the areas that they look at with regards to development and control, they look at, is the development aesthetically pleasing in the living environment? Okay, so this is important because human and animal and plant life, it's important that that we exist in a comfortable and pleasing environment, because if this does not occur, it affects our basic functions and our ability to function at our best. Okay, so you're talking about things like air quality, too much noise, things that make you uncomfortable, that can affect the quality of life of all living things. You're looking at the divisions, control, development and control with regards to the provision of adequate services to the community. So adequate services may include things like public utilities like water and electricity, proper roads. Other services would include things like health services, etc. So it's quite a huge job. We also look at the compatibility. They also look at the compatibility among different land uses. For example, you're not going to put a residential community right next to an industrial estate. Those two land uses adjacent to each other, just they are not compatible. They don't fit at all. Then they look at privacy between buildings. According to laws, you find that there are requirements that require a certain amount of distance between your property boundary and your building. So there's a setback, all right, and also between different buildings that would often provide some amount of protection for fire protection, for example. You don't want fires being able to jump from one building to the next so easily. Then you also look at the design of the buildings for natural light, ventilation. All those things are requirements of development. And also in certain designated land use zones, is there space allocated for recreational open space, such as parks, savannas, etc. Continuing with town and country planning, they're also responsible for municipal buildings. So we're not talking on this slide specifically about at the highest level, but municipal building and development. So that's at the lower levels, and in particular in built-up areas. So we're looking at their control over the granting of approvals for building and land development. Town and country planning is usually responsible for that. They're responsible for the inspection of the buildings under construction to ensure that they meet the requirements that town and country planning has set forth in their policies and regulations. Um, they also looked at the construction planning for major construction sites. For example, where you have major construction sites, you have the boards that would be put up around the construction sites as fences, usually to protect the public. Um, they are involved in the enforcement of actions against illegal construction. So where illegal constructions are taking place, where people are putting up buildings and constructions without having received approvals, town and country planning would issue notices, usually asking them to desist and remove what they have done. If persons are in violation of that, town and country planning can take additional steps to enforce it and ensure that they stop. Um, that enforcement might involve the demolition of the structure, um, fines, penalties, etc. Excuse me. Town and country planning would also be involved, excuse me, in the reviewing of EIAs where you have major development taking place. So, for example, the EMA will oversee the development of the environmental impact assessment where you have, let's say, a large um, residential complex being built in an area where there are concerns of environmental impacts. EMA will conduct that and develop that environmental impact assessment report, and that would be reviewed by town and country planning as part of the approval process. The town and country planning also provides advice on all building related matters to the general public. Now, still with government administration, well, here in Trinidad and Tobago, every time we change from one administration to the next, we find ministry names changed. So here in 2020, we highlight the Ministry of Planning and Development, and what they are responsible for is the guiding and formulating of environmental policy. So environmental policy would be developed under this ministry. This ministry also helps to monitor and evaluate the implementation and effectiveness of the policies that they created. So we don't just create a policy in isolation and drop it on a desk and leave it there. Those policies must be implemented. So they oversee that. They also oversee for effectiveness. So if they find weaknesses or problems with the effectiveness of the policy, it will constantly be reviewed and updated. They're responsible for design and implementation of environmental programs and projects in alignment with the national policies in terms of the environment. Um, Projects and programs may include things like 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 the national recycling program that is being developed at the moment for implementation across the country, conservation projects, etc. Now, the Environmental Management Authority is the agency under the Ministry of Planning and Development. So they are like a division, if you will. Um, their responsibility is for the stewardship of Trinidad and Tobago's natural resources and the environment. So they're responsible for overseeing and monitoring and managing the environment. In terms of meeting our current and future human, ecological, and economic needs. So when we see those combination of words there, human, ecological, and economic needs, we're talking about sustainable development, right? So this division, that is the Environmental Management Authority, it was established by an act of parliament, which is the Environmental Management Act, and the agency facilitates cooperation amongst government agencies, like we talked about Town and Country Planning Division already, the Ministry of Planning and Development, etc., non-governmental organizations, and community-based organizations, so our NGOs and CBOs. So the Environmental Management Authority is responsible for developing and enforcing laws and regulations related to the government. So remember, we have the Environmental Management Act. So they will develop the laws and enforce it. They have EMA has systems in place for the enforcement, like the environmental police unit, and then we also have the environmental commission, where you can take where citizens can take complaints to the Environmental Management Authority for decisions to be made. And they are also responsible for educating the public about environmental issues. So besides government administration, another important strategy or another important issue to look at with regards to environmental solutions are in international agreements. So the first one we want to highlight here is the Basel Convention. All right. So the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal, that is what it is. The words bolded there is really just to highlight to you the different aspects, major aspects of the convention. It looks at transboundary, like a cross-jurisdictional boundary from one country to another, the movement of those waste, and the concerns about the disposal of the waste. So the most comprehensive global environmental, it is the most comprehensive global environmental agreement on hazardous waste and other waste. It aims to protect human health and the environment against the adverse effects resulting from the generation of the waste, management. So management would involve the handling of the waste, storage of the waste, etc. How do we execute the movement of the waste from one country jurisdiction to another, and that usually involves transportation by sea. And then finally, when it reaches its destination, what systems are in place for the safe disposal of those hazardous waste? And much of these hazardous waste will often come from industrial activities. So the Basel Convention came into force in 1992, and generally member states are expected to observe the principles of the convention. So once you sign on to it, there is an expectation that you would abide by the principles of the convention. So Trinidad and Tobago signed on to the convention in 1994, so that's 2 years later. And the responsible agency in terms of implementing the principles of the agreement in Trinidad and Tobago is the EMA, the Environmental Management Authority, and they're responsible for receiving and responding to notifications of transboundary movements of hazardous waste and other materials. So say, for example, if a hazardous waste cargo has to pass through our waters to get to another destination elsewhere, EMA will be notified, and EMA will have to take certain actions in order to ensure that they pass through our territorial waters safely without causing any kind of harm to our people and our environment. Then there's the Earth Summit. So the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. This was also famously known as the Rio Summit, or in other words, the Earth Summit. This was held in 1992. This summit was very significant in that it influenced all subsequent UN conferences, which examined the relationship between human rights, population, social development, women, and human settlements as it relates to the environment. So when you see all of those different areas and elements coming together with regards to the environment, we are talking about sustainable development within the context of the environment. So what was the message of the summit? What were the main points? Firstly, that nothing less than a transformation of our attitudes and behavior would bring about the necessary change. So we found that there was a growing awareness on the part of many countries at the leadership level across the world that we as human beings could not continue to exist in isolation of or independently of our environment. And there was growing understanding of that connectivity between our survival and dependence on the environment. So this led to two legally binding conventions: the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, with a focus there on conservation of our natural resources. And then the other important one was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we had two major legally binding conventions that occurred here, one with a focus on biological diversity and the other on climate change. So let's look at the Paris Climate Accord, or the Paris Climate Agreement. If you have been paying attention to what's happening in the news in the last few years, you would have heard a lot of talk about the Paris Accord or the Paris Agreement, where we had countries like the United States under the Trump administration withdrawing from the Paris Accord because of fundamental disagreements about the actual legitimacy of the existence of climate change, right? So this agreement within that United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change dealt with the greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. So, to try to reduce greenhouse gases, and, what actions could be taken. And also, the financing of the agreement began in the year 2020. Additionally, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, so we come back to this one again. This was entered into force, into force in 1993, and this represented a dramatic step toward the conservation of our biological diversity and the sustainable use of its components, all our natural resources, sustainable use of it, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. This is important here because now we're talking about disadvantaged people groupings not having fair access to many of these natural resources for their own benefit as well. All right. So what were the major themes of the Earth Summit? Patterns of production that looked at production of toxic. So we're talking about pollution here. Patterns of toxic components resulting from burning of fossil fuels, etc. All right. Additionally, another major theme was the looking at alternative sources of energy in order to replace those fossil fuels that have been, a lot of research has actually linked it to global climate change. Additionally, looking at the reliance on public transportation systems. So that was being emphasized as an alternative or a possible solution to reducing vehicle emissions. So if you have increased national agendas to move towards the expansion of public transportation, such as buses and trains, etc., with the hope and expectation to reduce the congestion in cities and reduce the amount of air pollution and health problems associated with it. Additionally, there was also a greater awareness of and concern over the growing scarcity of water. So that was another major theme. So remember, when we talk about scarcity of water, we're not only talking about the scarcity of water in terms of the volumes that are available to us, which could be affected by things like um, climate change and drought, etc. But scarcity could also be reflected in availability or reducing availability of potable or safe sources of drinking water. Then we also have the Ramsar Convention. This is one that you all by now should also already be somewhat familiar with. So this was also called the Convention on Wetlands. It's an intergovernmental treaty that provides the framework for the following, right? So many different governments were involved, looking at national action and international cooperation. So individual governments would be bound to take actions to safeguard their wetlands ecosystems, and then there would also be international cooperation available, whether it's in terms of provision of expertise, financing, etc. It also ensured the conservation and wise use of the wetlands and the resources. So remember, we cannot live on this earth without interacting with and depending on our natural resources. So wise use and conservation of the resources is a very important part of environmental management and environmental solutions. So the convention was entered into force by Trinidad and Tobago in 1993. Okay, and Trinidad and Tobago now currently has 3 sites that have been designated as Ramsar sites. We have the Boca Reef, Caroni Swamp, and the River Swamp. Now continuing with international agreement, and we also have the Kyoto Protocol, 1997. This was an international agreement also linked to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, the major feature of this protocol, this Kyoto Protocol, is that it sets binding targets for 37 industrialized countries and the European community for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this was the significance of it, the setting of binding targets in order to reduce greenhouse emission. Now, the main difference between the protocol and the convention itself is that the convention encouraged the industrialized countries to reduce their emissions, but the protocol committed them to do so, right? So a commitment may, for example, result in penalties and actions being taken. All right, maybe you could look at things like on an international level, they may implement things like trade embargoes. They will try to force you by different measures to fall in line with the commitments that you've made by signing on to it. Okay. So at this point, before we go into the strategies, we will take a short break and resume the second part of the lecture.